I'm going to show you how to turn an ordinary 6-quart Sterilite bin into a productive isopod colony. So you can get super complicated with keeping isopods, and you can measure out vents and create all sorts of little holes and patterns, and some people get really complicated with it, and more power to them. They're doing great breeding isopods, and that's fantastic. I'm just super lazy, and I like it super simple. And I've been really surprised that what I do has worked from everything from my dairy cows all the way up to my rubber duckies, and I'm super pleased with that. So the first thing that I do is I take a hot iron, like a little soldering iron, and I use a little tiny tip on that, and I poke a bunch of little holes along the top edge. And you want those to be as high as possible, and you want them to be under the little rounded bit. Because this actually helps keep your isopods in the bin. If you have larger holes and if they're lower down, then your isopods can easily leave. Whereas if you have them up high and you keep this stuff inside the bin low enough, then the isopods won't be able to climb out. So once that's done, I usually set them aside for a few days because they do smell terrible after that, and I try to do that outside if it's not too cold. The next thing that you need to consider is substrate. So it is really easy to think about that in terms of how we think about reptiles, and just think about like keeping them moist and giving them a place to live. However, because isopods are decomposers in nature, they really need their substrate to be providing them with good nutrition. So you don't want to use coconut coir or cocoa chips because they're sterile and provide very little nutrition to the isopods. You can pick up some really cool mixes. The ABG works really well for isopods, and you can also buy isopod specific brand soils from some big brands that have mixed all kinds of goodies into it, and that's a great choice, but it's also a more expensive choice. I have found that just topsoil from the hardware store works just fine. You want something that's organic, and you want it to not have a lot of fertilizers in it. So getting a potting mix is usually a bad choice because they'll be full of organic fertilizers. So even if you are choosing organic, the fertilizers can warm up your bin like a compost, and that can be bad for your isopods. So this topsoil has a lot of like bits of bark and stuff in it, and it's just basic. I think we paid like $2 for the bag. And I put a bunch of that in the bottom of the bin. I did not think about the fact that this would make my hands all dirty, and that I don't have the best equipment to make this video. So you have your dirt, and it's just on the bottom. I like to include a lot of things that they're going to eat, and that's going to help keep them healthy. So I will add some calcium, and you can add calcium that's specific for reptiles, like the powdered calcium. You can add grit that you can buy for chickens, which includes oyster shell or limestone, or in this case you can add crushed up eggshells. Some people worry about the bacteria that can happen in eggshells, and they'll bake them at 200 degrees to make sure all the bacteria is dead. I've actually done that, although there's some people who argue that the bacteria is good for the isopods and so forth. So it can be a debate in the community. Then I like to add leaves. Leaves are another thing that they fight about. You can sterilize your leaves by boiling or baking them. I actually do that not because I want to make sure there's no bacteria on them, but because living in the Carolinas, you can accidentally bring in roaches with your leaves, and I don't want to do that. So by sterilizing them, I make sure that there are no pests that I don't want in the house. And then the leaves sit around in bags for the whole year. So if there were roaches in there, then they would be in the reptile room. So I'm pretty generous with the leaves. They're going to eat a lot of that. I also like to add some wood chips. And I do that by, I purchased a bag of hemp bedding, and it's fairly expensive, but it goes a really long way because I add just a little handful to each of my bins, just like that. Then I mix all my goodies together, and this is the base for my isopods. Then it gets super simple from here because you're gonna take moss and make a hydration station. This is going to be moist moss that you're going to keep moist all the time, and you're just going to stick a handful of that on one end. You do want to make sure that you're not piling it up too tall, because if the isopods can climb up out the holes, they will. And so that goes on one end of your bin. On the other end of the bin, I like to put more leaves, just like this. Again, you don't want them to be too high. And this can be a danger zone. If you have big leaves and their stems lead up to the holes, your isopods will leave. The last thing I do is I put a piece of cork bark in the middle. And I use cork bark because it's easy and affordable, and I can have it shipped to my door. However, it does not have a lot of good nutrition for your isopods. So if you source bark from outside, that can be an even better option. You do want to consider pests if that's a concern in your area, and you can also bake those. All that being said, keeping things non-sterile is really good for your isopods because they do eat the bacteria, and you are creating a whole mini ecosystem for them. Now what I do is I always pick up the cork bark and I feed my isopods underneath it. Now when you first get your bin all set up and you put your 10 isopods in there, you don't need to feed them for quite a while. They're going to eat the organic matter that's in your soil. They're going to munch on your leaves and your moss, especially if you've chosen a good forest moss like this instead of sphagnum moss. They'll eat that really well. This is the forest moss that we have today from Exoterra. So you won't need to supplement feed them. If you want them to breed really well and you would like it to be a big thriving colony, then over time you'll need to add supplemental feeding underneath your cork bark. So the last tip that I have before we get going is that when you take your isopods and you've got your little 10 count, they're going to come in some sort of cup. This is the cup that I use here at Danielle's Critters. But you don't want to dig through there to make sure that there's 10. I know it's really tempting because you're like, did they really give me 10? Because disrupting them can be even harder for them to settle in. So I highly recommend you just dump that cup in. I always pack mine in moss, and then you could just dump it on the mossy side. You can also pick up the cork bark, especially if there's a lot of dirt in your little cup, and dump it underneath your cork bark. And then you're all set to go. And I water my isopods once a week because the moss stays moist enough for that. So I'll water the moss, and then I feed once or twice a week, depending on my schedule. And I'm really trying to get my isopods to multiply. This method is simple, and I've used it all the way across the board, really from the dairy cows all the way to the rubber duckies. A lot of people will talk about different species having different requirements and doing better in different environments, and that may be true. It might work out better if you provide more ventilation for certain species and less ventilation for other species. But for me, I just like to keep it as simple as possible. And I'm super glad that my rubber duckies are having babies. Hopefully they'll be available for sale probably this fall. Which will be fun. Everybody's always asking for the rubber duckies. So, if you're brand new here, I'm Danielle with Danielle's Critters, and I would love it if you'd subscribe and come back. I'll have lots of upcoming reptile videos, as well as some isopod videos and lots of cool stuff. Thanks. Have a great day.